Hello. Well, what we're going to do is flip the classroom here. So for those of you who are face-to-face anyway, for online, what we're going to do is get a less chatty version of the lecture and then some opportunities afterwards for some wrap-up from the students, which I will record when we have face-to-face class. But because we've had such great interaction from the class, I'm really enjoying this group, I have to say. I like the way that you're talking with each other, with me, that you're raising questions and letting our conversation really go beyond the superficial. But because there's been so much interaction, we've slipped a little further behind than some of us feel comfortable with. So what I want to do today is just head through the headline issues for consideration and get us in a position where we can move forward a little bit quicker through the next little bit. So what are the objectives of this topic? We're going to explore the nature of consideration itself. Consideration, whilst we've talked about it off and on already over the last 4 weeks, is probably a term that has a technical meaning that you might not have really been able to come to grips with before you started being a law student. So we're going to work out what that word means in a legal sense and what the nature of consideration is. We're going to understand when consideration is required for the formation of a contract because, spoiler alert, even though I've said a number of times, unless we have consideration, we don't have a contract, it is possible to create legally binding obligations without consideration in very limited circumstances. And we're also going to identify, as we quite often do here, what is not consideration. So we're going to understand what consideration is by excluding the things that it's not. The reading is there, pretty straightforward. As always, this topic is covered in Chapter 4 of both your text and your casebook. So we start from the premise that consideration is one of the preconditions for the creation of a legally enforceable agreement. And in this topic, we're going to examine the rules on what constitutes a valid consideration and, of course, the exceptions to the rules. So I want to start with this big mind map, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, which is really just a framework for thinking through the question of whether there's legally sufficient consideration. So again, I find these kind of approaches really useful. It's kind of problem-solving approaches. Please excuse my dog in the background. Not a lost dog. So when is consideration required? Consideration is required to make a contract enforceable. So it is one of the formation elements. So we look at it from the point of view of the case law as a concept that for a promise to become legally binding, the promisee, so that's the person receiving the benefit of the promise, must give consideration to the promisor, the person who's making the promise, in exchange for the promise. So when a contract is made by an exchange of promises, each party's promise is consideration in support of the other's promise. So the textbook uses this kind of quite difficult language where consideration is the price of the promise, and a promise can be the price of a promise. And when we explore this idea of quid pro quo, I think this will become clearer, and we can really easily get ourselves knotted up here. I like to stand back for and think, for a contract to be legally binding, both parties need to have obligations so that both parties can have rights. So if you make a promise to do something, that is, you take on an obligation, you do that in exchange for a right. That right that you have might in fact be the right to have the other party fulfill their promise. So it might be a promise to provide services in exchange for a promise to receive payment, that payment will be made to you for those promises. The other way of flipping that around is the other party is promising to pay money in exchange for a promise to provide services. So in a bilateral contract, contract is made at a point where both parties still have obligations, and we all recognise it might be more than two, but let's keep it simple now. Both parties have obligations, and both parties have the right to benefit as a consequence of the other party performing those obligations. So when is consideration not required? I've gone a little bit quickly there with the crossing off of my X. There are two exceptions to the rule that a contract isn't binding unless it's supported by consideration. So the first of these is where a contract is made under seal. Now, as you well know now, that the elements of formation of a contract are agreement, comprising offer and acceptance, consideration, certainty, and intention. None of those things are written instrument, written document. However, in circumstances where a promise is made using a particular kind of written instrument, that's an equitable instrument or a deed. So if the promise is made under seal or using a deed, then there is no requirement for consideration. That serious promise that's made under a deed um, results in a binding promise even when it's not in exchange for consideration. Um, Deeds are the only way that you can create a binding obligation where there's only one party or a binding set of rights. A really good example of that is a deed poll, which is an instrument that people will use when they're changing their name, for example. The other time when consideration is not required, and this is kind of a misnomer in a way, is where a promissory estoppel arises. So, and essentially, uh, that is a circumstance where a party will be stopped from denying the existence of a contract for want of consideration because it would be unfair in some way for them to use that technicality to get out of the contract. This is something that you will discuss in more detail in advanced contract, but it's our starting point. So going back to my mind map that I mentioned before, before we even ask that question, is there legally sufficient consideration? It's worth asking ourselves, is there a deed? Because if there is a deed or potentially a circumstance where a promissory estoppel could operate, then actually we don't need to make any further inquiries. We don't need to go any further.